Why insects? What was it that kind of triggered that? Were you doing studies or research about this prior to this?
No, not at all. The studies and research I was doing was just looking at the amount of water that our current agriculture consumes, both in the United States as well as globally, and it's very evident from people that are looking at that we need some large scale changes, and we don't have that path mapped out with what we're currently eating. We just know that we can't eat what we are eating today, 50 years from now, and so just constantly looking for alternative solutions or ways that we can use less water with our food supply. So when I heard about insects, then I started crunching the numbers from a water supply, and they're about the most water efficient form of food we could eat. So it just makes sense. They eat them all over the world, and then the more I looked into it, the Native Americans used to eat them here, and it's really just a small population of Eastern Europeans that came over here and influenced our agricultural system, but it doesn't make sense moving forward. We've been doing it for the past couple hundred years the way we have, but it can't move forward. So that's really kind of the lens that I was looking through.
So this is interesting. So ultimately, you were more trying to solve the water issue, and as a result, kind of ended up also looking at this food element that involves fixing the water element as well.
Exactly. Yeah, I like to look at kind of macro changes. What are the largest impacts we can have to a problem that we're trying to solve? And so if I was specifically trying to solve our water problem, and globally, our food uses 90% of our water, so that naturally I gravitated towards, having the most impact. And so I just by nature focused on our food supply.
But wouldn't it, just out of curiosity, because I'm not necessarily an expert on this, but when you're saying, well, our food, like we're talking about maybe cows and other elements of what we eat, correct?
Yeah, everything of what we eat. Yeah, but cows happen to be kind of one of the least efficient. It's a very intensive water production for their food supply, and then they're not very efficient at turning that food into food for us. So that's primarily what it is. Yeah.
So I guess the ideology would be that by having this alternate source of food, we wouldn't need to impregnate every cow out there to keep producing more and more offspring over and over, or you're saying somehow we would delete that as an entire species in order to be able to sustain the water supply.
Yeah, it's kind of it's a
you know what I mean? Because they're still going to be there.
Totally.
You can't take the cows away from the land, like.
Well, you can.
Well, that's what,
they
that's
are
what
in
I
many
get
areas.
To. So tell me about how you.
Yeah, no. Really, what it comes down to is that as a scientist, one of the fundamental beliefs I have is that diversity equals health. And so you look at any ecosystem, if you look at a river environment, the greater diversity of fish in it and macroinvertebrates, the healthier that water is, the higher quality water. And so if you apply that to a financial portfolio, the more diverse it is, the healthier it will be, the more it will be able to withstand changes in our economy. And so looking at our food supply the same way, we've been trending towards fewer and fewer species. And so I'm not necessarily looking at replacing cows with insects. I'm looking at increasing the diversity. Let's take a fraction of our cattle consumption and put it toward insects, which are much more efficient. But yeah, it's really all about increasing the diversity, and if we are going to increase it, we should be increasing it with a more efficient food supply than a very wasteful one like cattle and beef consumption.
So let's go into this phase where now you have this idea, you kind of decide, you know what, we need to eat insects more often. Why do you think that's never kind of been accepted before? I mean, people have brought up things like this, I think, in the years, and it's never really sustained. Why do you feel that this is going to be different with Chipotle?
Yeah, it's interesting. It was kind of the first time I had heard of it when I listened to this particular TED Talk about 5 years ago. But then I just dove into the research, and as you're saying, people have been talking about it for decades and decades and decades. But kind of the conclusion of what everyone said was, our culture won't accept it. It makes sense on all levels. It makes sense nutritionally, it makes sense environmentally, but our culture won't accept it. And they kind of left it at that. So that was really the challenge that I saw in front of me was, let's present it in a culturally acceptable format. And it does make sense. It's feasible. All the logistics are in place. The supply chain is there. It's built out. And so we just became a marketing company essentially to address that cultural component of it and break that down to make room for a very logical, very highly nutritional product. So everything we do is addressing that cultural component and looking at, and we've looked at other industries that had that same challenge. So the really typical one is the parallel is sushi. Sushi introduced the United States. Nobody ate it and struggled as an industry in the mid '60s, and then it was very strategically crafted to kind of make a baby step for us with California roll. And so they put the rice on the outside of the nori, make it really familiar visually, and so all of those psychological elements we knew we had to apply to eating insects. And so that's why we grind it up, turn it into a flour. You don't have to see it. Turn it into an energy bar. Very familiar product to our culture. So, it's in a way it's reverse engineering a problem at the consumer level. So there's plenty of other examples of foods that we eat that are consumer driven, even though they don't make sense as an agricultural product. I think the best example I use is sea bass, and it was viewed as this high end fish, and we were willing to pay a premium for it. But study after study, nobody can tell the difference in taste between sea bass and any other white fish. There's no higher quality protein content, and yet because that consumer perception of a higher value is in place, it funded the growth of a farming industry for a very wasteful species. It's very resource intensive. So a lot of the overfishing is gathering feed for the sea bass farming industry. And it just doesn't make sense, but it started at that consumer level. So we knew we had this really efficient form of food, and so let's reverse engineer it. Let's start at that consumer level, create a pull-through demand for a much more logical, much more sustainable food supply.